Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to the Temple Institute Parsha class. My name is Gedalia Meyer, and I'm podcasting from Maladumim in Israel. Somewhat ironically, but not surprisingly, our names are the single greatest factor in determining our identity. Other people almost invariably identify us with our names. This is the universal and almost defining attribute of who we are as human beings. There is really no alternative in the vast repertoire of human terms. We, for better or worse, are identified by our names. There may be a few numbers that are also used, but these pale in significance to a genuine name. It is not only others who identify us by our names. We ourselves, despite a certain amount of inner resistance to this artificial means of identity, also fall victim to its ubiquitous power. When we speak to ourselves, we frequently find ourselves using that name as a means of address. As ridiculous as this might seem, it seems to be quite common, if not universal. Can anyone explain why this is so? Why should we frame our self-image around this sound that was given to us at birth through some whim of our parents or whoever it was who imposed this identity upon us? But we do, and there is pretty much nothing we can do about it. We are stuck with this thing like we are stuck with our own DNA. We can change it over the course of our lives if we so choose. This works with varying success depending on the circumstances. Perhaps doing this makes a person's name more legitimate in their eyes, but it really doesn't make all that much of a difference where the name originated from. Either way, it is still the single most prominent identifying feature of us all. If we think about it, we might seriously question how things came to be this way. Why should a somewhat arbitrary sound have so much influence over our personal identity? Why did we let things get like this? But nobody asks these questions. We accept that this is the way things are, and that's that. This is the way it is in every culture on the planet. From the time we first became cognizant of others around us and the words they use, we learned to accept this as the primary definition of who we are. It sticks with us to our dying day and even gets enshrined forever on our tombstones. Those remains, in whatever state they are in, are perpetually associated with that name. It has been this way since time immemorial. From the earliest writing that could be called literature, we see evidence of this. There is no reason to believe that it wasn't this way long before the invention of writing. It probably goes back to the unrecorded eons in the caves. It may even be among the earliest creations of Homo sapiens. It is hard to imagine anyone who could be called a human being not possessing a name. Many of us might consider such a person more of an animal than a human. As ignorant and as nonsensical as this may seem, it is hard to deny its truth. The Bible, of course, is no exception to this practice. From the very first person to the least significant in some genealogy, everybody has a name. Even God has a name. It is interesting, however, that the Bible actually goes through the evolution of how people first gained this means of identity. When Adam is first created, he doesn't have an actual name. That only comes some time later, perhaps in the Garden of Eden. Adam gives his wife a name only after the whole story with the snake and the forbidden tree. But once it was done, there was no going back. It happens that some of the famous personalities of the early Bible have their names changed. Abraham's name is changed from its original Avram by the addition of a single letter. Sarah's original name was Sarai, the difference being a switch of the final letter. Another of these is Jacob or Yaakov, whose name was changed in some manner to Israel or Yisrael. It is hard to say which ultimately became his primary name. They are used interchangeably throughout the second half of Genesis. His case is unique in that both names remain with him forever as a means of identifying him and describing him. He is both Yaakov and Yisrael, sometimes within a single verse. One of these relatively rare occurrences is in this week's Parsha. The Parsha is called Vayigash, which means he approached. This word introduces the dramatic interchange between Joseph and Yehudah concerning the fate of their younger brother Benjamin, who was framed for stealing a precious royal goblet at the end of last week's Parsha. In the course of this dialogue, Joseph finally reveals himself to his brothers. This highly emotional revelation is the climax of the events of the past few Parshas, beginning with Joseph's dreams and his being sold by his brother as a slave. He led them through a maze of intrigue and imprisonment when they came seeking food in Egypt, while he was in charge of provisions throughout the famine. His goal was to somehow put it into their heads that their hatred of him was wrong and to drive them to a state of regret. When he saw that their backs were against the proverbial wall and they were begging for the life of his full brother Benjamin, even being willing to put themselves in his place, Joseph understood that the time was right to reveal his true identity to them. So the brothers were reunited once again. Joseph promised them that he would support them in Egypt and that this was all part of God's plan to bring them here so that they could survive the famine. He then told them to return to Canaan to bring their father down to Egypt to live out his final years there. They return home and tell Yaakov all that had happened, including, of course, that his long-lost son was alive and a ruler in Egypt. His initial reaction was one of denial. The Torah states that, quote, his heart fluttered or something along those lines because he didn't believe them. Then it says that, quote, he saw the wagons that Joseph sent to carry him and the spirit of their father Yaakov revived. There is no explanation in the text for this abrupt change of mind. The following verse states, Yisrael said, my son Joseph is still alive. I shall go and see him before I die. Immediately after this, we read of the journey from the land of Canaan to go to Egypt. Quote, Yisrael traveled along with everything he had and came to Beersheba. He offered sacrifices there to the God of his father. Next, God comes to Yisrael in a vision of the night and says to him, Yaakov, Yaakov. This vision tells him to not be afraid about going down to Egypt. Quote, for I shall make you into a great nation there. I will go down with you and even come back up, and Joseph shall place his hands upon your eyes. The rest of the parsha deals with Yaakov's reuniting with Joseph and the settling of the whole family in the region of Goshen, which was somewhere to the north. This includes what seems to be the single meeting of Yaakov and the Pharaoh in the story. Pharaoh, somewhat strangely, asks Yaakov how old he is. Yaakov's response is an odd expression of regret and grief over the fact that his life has been filled with pain and that despite living 130 years, he hasn't attained the years that his forefathers did in the course of their journeys. Two of the events in the parsha involve a mixture of the two names of the key figure involved. When Yaakov first hears about Joseph still being alive, he refuses to believe it. Then he comes around and accepts it for no apparent reason. The Torah states that it was Yaakov whose heart fluttered in disbelief and whose spirit was revived. But then it states that it was Yisrael who declared that Joseph is still alive and that he would go and see him before he died. There is no explanation for why the Torah switches from one name to the other. At first it was Yaakov and then it was Yisrael. Since they are one and the same person, this is not considered a major problem. Next, God comes to Yisrael in that vision of the night, but addresses him by stating the name Yaakov not once but twice. It is Yisrael who experiences the vision, but Yaakov whose name is called. This is the example of the rare case in which both of his names are used to refer to him in a single verse. It is Yisrael who has the vision, but Yaakov who is told to not fear going down to Egypt. What is the meaning of the mixture of these two names in this short incident? There must be some significance as to why both names are used. Perhaps these two consecutive stories reveal to us something about who Yaakov was. As an individual person, he was Yaakov. That was the name given to him at birth, and it was how he was identified both to himself and to others. But his name was divinely changed to Yisrael at a crucial juncture in his life a few parshas earlier. This also became his name. This curious mixing of the two names is rarely discussed in the classic commentaries. It is possible that the new name, Yisrael, was never meant to be a traditional personal name. That forever was to remain Yaakov. But Yisrael was his name as the founder of his future nation. And the destiny of that nation was to experience. He always remained Yaakov the person, but he was also to be called Yisrael, the progenitor of the nation. It was Yaakov who refused to believe that Joseph was still alive. This was too much for this man to handle at that moment. But his spirit was revived when he saw the wagons and understood that things were already underway that went beyond his individual power. It was Yisrael who declared Joseph was still alive and that he would go and see him. He had transitioned in that moment from the individual to the nation. This matter went beyond the emotions of an individual person. Similarly, with that vision of the night, it was Yisrael who experienced it. This was not a matter for the single person Yaakov. This was the fate of the nation that was being forged. But the individual person Yaakov was still there, feeling fear over the events happening to him and wondering what they meant. That individual's fears had to be addressed, even as the collective person Yisrael was being told his fate. These two identities existed within one person. He was both the individual and the first person of the future nation. The two names and the two identities they represented each fit a different aspect of his being. They reacted and expressed things in different ways to reflect who they were. Perhaps we all have these dual identities in some way. We could have one name for our friends and another to our family. We could be different people with different identities depending upon the circumstances. These identities reveal the truly complex nature of who we are. Our names do reveal and define our identity, but we may possess more than one name. Shabbat Shalom.